He hadn't spoken to his daughter in over a decade. There were nights when he would sit in the dark, staring at an old photograph, trying to remember the sound of her laughter, only to realize that even that memory was beginning to fade. In fact, there were days when he questioned whether she was still alive at all, or if she had simply become a ghost in his past, a chapter of his life that had been closed without warning or explanation. But on a quiet metro ride one evening, surrounded by strangers who paid him no attention, a little girl sat beside him and began to sing, her voice soft, trembling, yet filled with a strange kind of warmth that cut through the noise of the train. What happened next would uncover a truth neither of them were prepared for, because that girl was not just a stranger, and the moment their worlds collided would set into motion a chain of events that neither time nor distance had been able to erase. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this girl, and why did her presence feel so unsettling to him in a way he couldn't explain? He had spent years trying to forget the life he once had, years convincing himself that some questions were better left unanswered. Yet in that moment, as her voice filled the space between them, it felt as though something buried deep inside him was being pulled back to the surface. Why did her voice sound so familiar, not just in tone, but in the way it carried emotion, the same quiet strength he once heard in someone he loved more than anything? And how could two strangers, sitting side by side on a crowded metro, share a connection that felt so personal, so unexplainable, that it almost defied logic? He tried to dismiss it as coincidence, the kind of fleeting moment people experience and quickly forget, but something about the way she looked at him, the way her words lingered even after she stopped singing, made it impossible to ignore. Was this simply chance, or was there something far deeper at play, something that had been set in motion long before this night, waiting for the exact moment their paths would cross again? David had not always been the man sitting quietly on that metro, holding back tears as strangers passed him by without a second glance. There was a time when his life had been full, structured, and certain, the kind of life many people spend years trying to build. He had a stable career, a home filled with laughter, and a family that once felt unbreakable. But that life began to fracture in ways he never truly understood, slowly at first, and then all at once. His marriage to Elena, a woman he once believed he would grow old with, turned into something strained and distant, marked by arguments that never seemed to find resolution. What began as small disagreements turned into silence, and that silence eventually became permanent. The divorce that followed was not just painful, it was devastating, leaving behind questions that neither of them fully answered. And somewhere in the middle of it all, he lost the one thing that mattered most to him. The last time he saw his daughter, she was only 5 years old, small enough to hold his hand without hesitation, young enough to believe that he would always be there. Elena had always been protective, even before everything fell apart, the kind of mother who kept her child close and her concerns closer. But after the divorce, something about her changed in a way that no one could quite explain. She became distant, guarded, unwilling to share even the smallest details about her life. Then, without warning, she disappeared, taking their daughter with her and leaving behind no clear explanation, no forwarding address, and no way for David to reach them. It was as if she had made a deliberate choice to erase him completely from their lives. Some people said she had simply run away, overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had happened, choosing distance as a way to start over. Others believed there was more to it, that she was hiding something she never wanted anyone to uncover. David searched for answers for years, following every lead no matter how small, but each one ended the same way, with silence and uncertainty. Mia, the little girl on the metro, had grown up in a world far removed from the one David once knew. Now around 11 years old, she lived a life shaped by struggle and responsibility far beyond her age. Her days were not filled with school activities or carefree afternoons, but with the quiet understanding that she needed to help her mother in any way she could. Elena, now weakened by illness, depended on her more than a child should ever have to carry. So Mia did what she could, standing on metro trains, singing softly to strangers who rarely looked at her long enough to truly see her, hoping that a few dollars might be enough to get them through another day. She had learned to be independent, to move through the world without asking too many questions, because the one question that mattered most had never been answered. She had no memory of her father, no stories to hold on to, only the quiet absence of someone she had never known. And in all the years she had grown up beside her mother, there was one thing that never changed. Elena never spoke about him, not once, as if his existence had been carefully erased from their lives. leaving behind a silence that Mia had learned not to break. For David, the metro had become more than just a way to get from one place to another. It was routine, predictable, and in some quiet way, it helped him pass time without having to think too deeply about the things he had lost. Every evening, he would take the same seat when it was available, stare out at the blur of tunnels and dimly lit stations, and allow his thoughts to drift back to questions that had never been answered. He had stopped expecting closure years ago, yet something in him refused to fully let go. There were moments, small and fleeting, when he felt as though he was close to understanding what had happened, but those moments always slipped away just as quickly as they came. On that particular evening, nothing felt different at first. The train moved as it always did. People came and went without noticing him, and the quiet hum of motion filled the space. But then he heard it, a soft melody rising above the noise, delicate yet steady, carrying a kind of emotion that made it impossible to ignore. At first, he didn't look up. He had heard street performers before, voices blending into the background of his routine without leaving any lasting impression. But this was different. There was something in the way the notes were carried, something in the pauses between the words, that made him feel as though he had heard it before, not recently, but long ago, in a place he could no longer reach. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned his head, and that was when he saw her. Mia had taken a seat beside him without asking, her presence quiet yet noticeable, her small frame contrasting against the worn interior of the train. She wasn't performing for attention, nor did she seem concerned with who was listening. She simply sang, as if it was the only thing keeping her steady in a world that demanded too much from her. And then, without warning, her voice seemed to settle directly into him, cutting through years of distance and silence in a way he couldn't explain. Her voice stopped him cold, not because of how perfect it was, but because of how familiar it felt, like something he had once known and somehow forgotten. When she finished, there was a brief moment where neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that feels heavier than words. Then Mia turned to him, studying his face with a quiet kind of curiosity, as if she could sense something he was trying to hide. She tilted her head slightly and said, "You look sad. My mama says singing helps." Her words were simple, almost casual, yet they landed with a weight that caught him off guard. David tried to respond, but for a moment, he couldn't find the right words. Instead, he gave a small nod, his expression softening in a way he hadn't allowed himself in years. He watched her more closely, carried herself, the small gestures that felt strangely familiar, the way her eyes held a depth that didn't match her age. There was something about her mannerisms, something in the way she spoke, and even the way she looked at him, that stirred a feeling he couldn't quite place. It wasn't just recognition, and it wasn't imagination either. It was something deeper, something that refused to settle into a clear explanation no matter how hard he tried to make sense of it. And as the train continued to move, carrying them both forward, David realized that it wasn't just the song that had unsettled him. It was something else entirely, something he couldn't explain, but knew he couldn't ignore. The moment should have passed like any other brief encounter between strangers, something easily forgotten once the train reached its next stop. Yet for David, it refused to leave his mind. As the metro continued its route, he found himself watching Mia in a way he couldn't justify, not out of suspicion at first, but out of a growing need to understand why her presence felt so familiar. He began asking small, careful questions, the kind that wouldn't alarm a child, but might reveal something more than she intended to share. Mia answered simply, without hesitation, but her responses were vague, shaped more by habit than detail. She told him she rode the metro often, that singing helped her earn a little money, and that she needed to get back home before it got too late because her mother wasn't well. When she spoke about her mother, there was a quiet seriousness in her tone, the kind that comes from responsibility rather than fear, and it struck him in a way he couldn't ignore. As the conversation continued, small details began to form a pattern that unsettled him more with each passing moment. The name she mentioned when he asked about her mother sounded familiar, not enough to be certain, but enough to linger in his thoughts. Then she spoke about the area where they lived, a neighborhood David hadn't thought about in years, a place tied to memories he had tried to leave behind. He felt a tightening in his chest as he listened, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to believe. Mia added that her mother didn't like people visiting, that she preferred to stay out of sight, and that they kept to themselves most of the time. It wasn't said with suspicion or secrecy, just a simple statement of fact, yet it carried a weight that made David's thoughts impossible to quiet. He sat there, caught between reason and something far more instinctive, asking himself a question he wasn't prepared to answer. Was he imagining things, connecting pieces that didn't belong together, or had something far more extraordinary just happen without him realizing it? When the train began to slow at the next stop, Mia stood up, adjusting the small bag she carried as if preparing to disappear back into the world she came from. For a brief moment, David considered letting her go, convincing himself that whatever he was feeling would pass once she was gone. But as she stepped off the train, something in him refused to stay seated. He followed, keeping his distance, careful not to draw attention, yet unable to turn back. The station was crowded, people moving in every direction, but he kept his eyes on her, watching as she navigated through the noise with quiet familiarity. She didn't look back, didn't seem to notice him at all, and that only made it easier for him to continue. As she exited the station and moved into the streets beyond, David stayed just far enough behind, his thoughts growing louder with every step. He told himself he needed clarity, that this was the only way to understand what he had just experienced, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was something he had been searching for without realizing it. Mia walked with purpose, turning down streets that felt increasingly familiar the further they went, until David began to recognize them not just as places he had once visited, but as pieces of a life he had lost. His pace slowed slightly, his breath catching as memories began to surface, each one sharper than the last. He watched as she approached a small, worn building, the kind most people would pass without a second glance, and paused briefly before stepping inside. David stopped where he was, his heart pounding in a way he couldn't control, every instinct telling him that whatever came next would change everything. For a moment, he hesitated, standing there as the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the present collided in his mind. Then, slowly, he moved closer, his eyes drawn to something near the entrance that made him freeze where he stood. And then, without warning, he saw something that made his heart stop. David stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the doorway Mia had just passed through, his mind struggling to process what he had seen. At first, it was just a feeling, a quiet recognition that crept in before logic could catch up, but then his gaze shifted slightly, landing on something near the entrance that made his breath catch. It was small, almost easy to miss, a worn-out object resting beside the door, but it carried a familiarity he couldn't ignore. He stepped closer, his movements slow, uncertain, as if approaching it too quickly might somehow make it disappear. And then it became clear. It wasn't just similar to something from his past, it was the same. A piece of a life he had once lived, a detail that should not have existed here, in this place, after so many years. His chest tightened, his thoughts racing, as the possibility he had been avoiding began to take shape in a way he could no longer deny. He looked up at the building again, really seeing it now, not just as another structure on a quiet street, but as something deeply connected to him. The walls, the windows, even the way the light fell across the entrance, all of it stirred memories he had buried long ago. His heart pounded harder with each passing second, a growing realization pressing against everything he thought he knew. There was no more room for doubt, no easy explanation to dismiss what he was feeling. If he walked away now, he knew he would carry this moment with him for the rest of his life, wondering what might have been waiting just beyond that door. And so, despite the fear rising inside him, he moved forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, until he finally reached the door. He stood there for a moment, his hand hovering just inches away, as if even this small action carried consequences he wasn't prepared to face. Then, with a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, he knocked. The sound echoed louder than it should have, filling the silence that followed in a way that made everything else disappear. Seconds passed, stretching into something longer, more unbearable, until he heard movement from inside. His heart raced, every emotion he had been holding back rising all at once, leaving him unsteady, uncertain of what he was about to face. The door opened slowly, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Time seemed to stop, the space between them filled with something neither of them could put into words. David stared, his eyes searching, trying to confirm what his mind was already beginning to accept. And then it became undeniable. Standing in front of him, changed yet unmistakable, was Elena. The years had altered her, softened some edges and deepened others, but there was no mistaking who she was. The same woman who had disappeared without a trace, the same woman who had taken his daughter and erased him from their lives, was now standing just a few feet away, looking at him with an expression that mirrored his own shock. For a moment, there were no words, only the weight of everything that had been left unsaid for years pressing down on them both. Elena's eyes widened slightly, her breath catching as recognition settled in, followed quickly by something else, something harder to define. Fear flickered across her face, not sudden or dramatic, but quiet and real, as if this was the moment she had always known might come but had hoped to avoid. David felt a surge of emotions he could no longer contain, anger rising alongside confusion, hurt blending with disbelief, all of it colliding in a way that left him struggling to steady himself. "You," was all he managed at first, his voice unsteady, carrying years of questions in a single word. Elena didn't respond immediately. Her gaze shifted for just a moment, as if searching for something beyond him, before returning to meet his eyes. There was tension in the way she held herself, a guarded stillness that suggested she was already preparing for what might follow. David's expression hardened slightly, not out of cruelty, but out of the pain that had been building for far too long. "You left," he said finally, the words breaking through the silence with a weight that neither of them could ignore. Elena's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out at first. Instead, her composure faltered just enough to reveal what she had been holding back. There was something in her eyes now, something deeper than fear, something closer to regret, though it didn't erase the distance between them. The silence stretched again, heavier this time, filled with everything they hadn't said, everything they hadn't understood. And then, without warning, the emotion David had kept buried for years broke through. His voice trembled, his control slipping as the reality of the moment settled in. She wasn't gone. She had been here, living a life he knew nothing about, raising a child he hadn't seen since she was 5. The weight of it all hit him at once, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to hold it back. The anger, the confusion, the loss, it all surfaced in a way he couldn't contain, his eyes filling as the distance between past and present collapsed into a single moment. Elena stood there, facing him, her own expression shifting as the reality of his pain became impossible to ignore. There were no easy explanations left, no simple way to bridge the years that had separated them. Only the truth remained, waiting to be faced, as both of them stood on opposite sides of a past that had never truly been resolved. For a long moment, neither David nor Elena spoke, the silence between them filled with years of unanswered questions and emotions that had never found a place to settle. It was Elena who finally broke it, her voice quieter than he remembered, yet steady enough to carry the weight of what she had been holding on to all this time. She didn't begin with an apology, and she didn't try to soften the truth. Instead, she told him something he had never expected to hear. She said she didn't leave to hurt him, and she didn't disappear to erase him. She left because she believed she had no other choice. The words came slowly at first, as if each one required her to confront something she had tried to keep buried. She explained that before she vanished, there had been accusations, serious ones, the kind that don't just affect a relationship but threaten everything around it. Someone had come forward with claims about David, claims that painted him as a danger, not just to her, but to their daughter. At the time, she didn't know what to believe, but fear made the decision for her. She chose to protect Mia the only way she thought she could, by leaving without warning and cutting off all contact. David stood there, absorbing every word, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief as the pieces began to fall into place. He had spent years questioning himself, wondering if there was something he had done wrong, something he had missed, but this was different. This was something outside of him, something he had never been given the chance to face or defend against. He shook his head slightly, his voice unsteady as he tried to process it. He told her those accusations were false, that he had never been given the opportunity to respond, and that everything he had lost had been taken from him without explanation. Elena listened, her composure weakening as the certainty she once held began to unravel. She admitted that over time, doubts had crept in, small at first, but persistent enough to make her question whether she had made the right decision. By the time she realized the truth might not be what she had believed, too much time had passed, and the distance between them had become something she didn't know how to cross. Before either of them could say more, a small voice interrupted the moment. Mia had been standing just inside the doorway, unnoticed at first, her eyes moving between them as she tried to understand what was happening. There was confusion in her expression, but also something deeper, a quiet realization beginning to take shape. She stepped forward slowly, her gaze settling on David with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "Mama," she said softly, her voice carrying a question she didn't fully know how to ask. Elena turned toward her, hesitation clear in her eyes, as if this was the moment she had been trying to delay for years. But there was no way around it now. The truth had reached them both, and it could no longer be held back. Mia looked at David again, studying his face in a way that felt strangely familiar, as if she were searching for something she had never seen but somehow recognized. The room grew quiet. the weight of the moment stretching out as everything seemed to slow. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked the question that changed everything. "You're my dad." The words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain, yet powerful enough to break through the distance that had separated them for so long. David felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the reality of it was almost too much to take in. Slowly, he nodded, his eyes never leaving hers, as if afraid that looking away might make the moment disappear. Mia didn't move at first. She simply stood there, taking it in, her expression caught between disbelief and something else, something softer, something that hadn't had a place in her life until now. Then, without thinking too much about it, she took a small step closer, and then another, until the space between them was no longer something that felt impossible to cross. David lowered himself slightly, meeting her at her level, his hands uncertain for just a moment before gently reaching out. When she didn't pull away, when she allowed the distance to close completely, it was enough. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't simple, but it was real. Elena watched them, her expression filled with a mixture of relief and regret, knowing that the years she had taken from them could never be returned, yet understanding that this moment still mattered. There were no easy resolutions, no way to undo everything that had happened, but there was something else, something just as important. There was a chance to move forward. In the days that followed, conversations that should have happened years ago finally began to take place. David stepped into a role he had been denied for so long, not with certainty, but with care, doing what he could to support Mia and help Elena in ways that felt long overdue. It wasn't about fixing the past, because some things can't be fixed, but about building something new from what remained. And in the quiet moments that followed, when everything settled just enough to reflect, one truth stood out above the rest. Sometimes, the people we spend years searching for are not as far away as we believe. Sometimes, they are closer than we ever imagined, waiting for a moment, a chance, or even a simple encounter to bring everything back into focus. The question that remains is not just about what happened, but about what comes next. If you were in his position, standing face to face with everything you had lost and everything you had just found again, would you forgive? As David stood there, holding on to a moment he once believed he would never get back, one question quietly lingers beyond everything that has been said and everything that has been revealed. What would you have done if you were him, faced with years of loss, unanswered questions, and a truth that changes everything in an instant? Would you hold on to the pain of what was taken from you, or would you find a way to move forward, even knowing that the past can never be rewritten? And what about Elena, a mother who made a decision out of fear, believing she was protecting her child, only to realize that the truth she trusted may not have been the truth at all? Do you believe this was fate bringing them back together after so many years, or was it simply coincidence, a chance encounter on a quiet metro ride that changed the course of their lives forever? Stories like this have a way of staying with us, not just because of what happens, but because of the questions they leave behind. Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective matters more than you think. And if this story moved you, if it made you reflect, feel, or see things differently, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that remind us just how unexpected life can be.